Hi, welcome to Album Soup, where we talk about the ingredients, influences, and genres that shaped a particular album. In this episode, we will be talking about The Ooze by King Krule, a really interesting and fascinating exploration of one man's psyche. Albeit an incredibly dark and disturbing album, this is a beautiful and incredibly creative album, and I cannot wait to get into the influences that shaped it. Archy Marshall, aka King Krule's music, really eludes easy genre for classification, and The Ooze is possibly his most blended project. Maybe that's why it's called The Ooze. At the same time, I do think that it's rooted in post-punk and rock more than anything else. Perhaps a bit less than his previous album, 6 Feet Beneath the Moon, but still, punk and rock are really at the root of The Ooze, and I think that talking about the albums that influenced him from that genre is a great place to start. So, my first album recommendation is The Clash with London Calling. A lot of critics have pointed out how Joe Strummer, The Clash's vocalist, influenced Archy's singing, and I think that is a very valid comparison to make. Archy has said that The Clash have influenced him as well. This album is also about London, and so is The Ooze. They both explore the gritty parts of that city, even if they're exploring them from several decades apart. My next recommendation is Talking Heads with Remain in Light. This is another album that Archy has said he really loves. The Talking Heads are possibly the most celebrated new wave band and kind of post-punk, I suppose, at the same time. I think Remain in Light is a really interesting album because of how much it blends as well. It's got those famed Afrobeat influences and everything. And Archy ultimately said that words cannot describe how he feels about this album. So I think it's a very fitting influence to talk about when talking about The Ooze. Next up is a slightly less well-known band called Joseph K with their album The Only Fun in Town. This album is more post-punk, although it's short and it's sweet and it's got a lot of catchy songwriting. I think that these guys deserve to be a lot more famous than they really are. Honestly, in doing the research about King Krule's influences, I discovered a lot of post-punk that I really liked, and this is one of the albums that really stood out the most to me. My last punk or post-punk recommendation is a very classic punk album with The Damned, Damned. This is a band that Archy has said is one of his favorites. They really made classic British punk like the Sex Pistols, but they did it with a bit more sophistication. They can actually play their influences, or oh my God, play their instruments. And while this is probably not my favorite album here, I can definitely hear the influence of punk, and I think it was well worth including. The next genre I'm going to be talking about is jazz punk. I don't think that King Krule's music is jazz, despite what many people say about it, but I do think that it has a lot of jazz influences, and I think that jazz punk is a really good thing a good label, I suppose, to talk about it. So in this section, I'm going to talk about a little bit of no wave, as well as some really hard jazz from the past that Archy has said he really likes. First up, I have The Contortions with Bye. This was a famous no-wave band, one of the biggest no-wave bands, but one of the jazziest as well. James Chance was a saxophone player. He just put so much energy into this music. It's so chaotic and it's so dissonant and abrasive. It's no-wave. If you're familiar with anything like Early Swans or Glenn Branca, then you know what I'm talking about. But this is a lot more jazzy, and I think I can hear a lot more influence on King Krule from this album specifically. Next up, though, we have one that's drifting a little bit deeper into jazz. Sometimes they're called no wave. I'm not really sure if they fit that, but I do think that they're a really unique band you should totally check out. This is the Lounge Lizards with their self-titled. Archy said that he admires them for making fake jazz. And I guess that I can't really say much more than that. The Lounge Lizards had a satirical, ironic twist on jazz, and at the same time, they were really good players. They put out some really great music. I think that their aesthetic was really fascinating, and I think their music is awesome. So I cannot recommend these guys enough. The last jazz punk recommendation I have is certainly not punk, but it's some of the hardest jazz I've ever heard. This is Charles Mingus with Blues and Roots. Charles Mingus came out, of course, a lot earlier than this. He died the same year that Bye, the Contortions album, came out. At the same time, his music is so angry and aggressive that I think the punk ethos is pretty apparent. This album is the one I chose to represent because it's the most stylistically consistent, I think, in his discography, or at least one of them. Unlike some of his other albums, which combine a lot of different things, this album is straight blues and roots, as the title suggests. The track Moanin' on here is one of the most insane compositions ever, and Mingus is my favorite musician of all time, so talking about him is always a treat. Okay, so far I've only talked about more harder genres. At the same time, the ooze has a lot of very soft and mellow and melodic and sensitive moments, and so for that reason, I have to talk about some softer stuff too. And while I did say that King Krule was influenced by harder jazz, it's undeniable that he was influenced by softer jazz as well. At the same time, he was influenced by bossa nova, so I'm kind of combining them into the same section. First up, I have Chet Baker with 50 Italian Strings. This is a very cinematic album, as 50 Strings might suggest. It's very somber. There's a lot more trumpet playing than singing. I know Chet Baker is famous for both of those. I would way rather listen to Chet play trumpet than hear him sing, so this album works a lot better for me than some of his more well-known ones. Next up, I have Bill Evans with Waltz for Debbie. Bill Evans is another jazz artist King Krule has said he really loves, and I think this album is possibly the best place to start. It features Scott LaFaro, a bassist who played with Bill Evans, but who died pretty shortly after this recording and wasn't on very many records. I think that this is just such a fantastic live album. It just embodies cool jazz, but it's a lot better than almost all the other cool jazz I've heard, so I totally recommend. Now a couple of bossa nova selections. First up, Antonio Carlos Jobim with The Composer of Desafinado Plays. Jobim was the guy who wrote The Girl from Ipanema, which is on this album. He wrote a number of other bossa nova standards, which have become jazz standards at this point. I prefer this album over some of his later stuff for the same reason that King Krule does. It's a bit more minimal. It's more stripped back. I think that kind of suits the bossa nova songwriting better. It lets the beautiful singing and songwriting speak for itself without a lot of overwhelming arrangements kind of obscuring that. And the next bossa nova album I have, and the last one for today, is possibly the most famous bossa nova album in the West, which is Getz Gilberto by Stan Getz and João Gilberto. A very famous album because it spread bossa nova to America because of Stan Getz's presence on it. He was an American saxophonist who collaborated on more than one bossa nova album down in South America, or at least bringing the Brazilians up to the United States. This album also contains The Girl from Ipanema. It's, I'd say, almost certainly the place to start if you're interested in bossa nova, both because it's so famous and because it's just so easy to listen to. It's so pleasant. It's so well done. It's just a really good encapsulation of the genre, although if you want to dive deeper, you can find some more interesting stuff perhaps. Next up, this is kind of jazz, and a lot of people would call this jazz, but I'm not going to say. This is crooners. These are singers from the mid 20th century, especially like the 50s and the 60s, that made jazz music, but also really just made adult contemporary pop. They were the pop stars of their day, even though their music is so different from what we might call pop in the 2020s. This music is so influential. I think we probably underestimate just how massive its contribution to pop music today is. And, a lot of it is really pleasant and worth revisiting and shouldn't just be considered like a relic of the past. First up, Frank Sinatra in the Wee Small Hours. I'm sure you've heard of Sinatra. He's one of the biggest musical icons of the 20th century. At the same time, he's a lot more talented, I think, beyond just his singing than a lot of people think. And this album is a really interesting concept album, proto-concept album, possibly the first concept album ever about, well, being lonely. This guy was known for being a sex symbol and being charismatic, but in this album, he's tender and heartbroken and sad. And I think that that is a really interesting change of pace for Frank. And I think that this album reminds me a lot of the Ooze in that emotional presentation. Next up, I have Dean Martin with At the Movies, another member of the Rat Pack along with Sinatra. I think this album is a lot less moving and interesting than In the Wee Small Hours, but King Krule clearly likes Dean Martin. And at the same time, given that he's a cinephile, I thought that a album with a lot of film soundtracks might be kind of the thing to represent Dean Martin here. I think that also speaks for the arrangements because, the 20th century, both in film score and in pop, had a lot more going for them in terms of arrangements than modern music does. Next up, I have possibly my least favorite artist I'm talking about today with Elvis Presley, and the album King Krule. Elvis was a thief. I do not apologize or defend him. At the same time, his influence is undeniable, and I cannot deny that the man had a charisma and a rugged charm to him, at least to a degree, and his stage performance and singing were very interesting and influential. So I think that it shouldn't be a surprise if you're very familiar with King Krule's work to hear that he was an Elvis fan, or at least found influence from Elvis. My last one here is definitely my favorite crooner album because it's so weird and unique. This is Scott Walker with Scott. Scott Walker ended his career pretty recently with some really avant-garde stuff. But back in the day, in the 60s, in his youth, he made pop music, and it was dramatic and baroque and so grandiose, and yet there was a darkness in his stuff that I just can't place. I don't know if King Krule actually listened to Scott Walker, but I wouldn't be surprised if he did. I think that this stuff is just takes that crooner sensibility but puts it into like a black mirror, and I'm just entranced by it. I can't stop listening to Scott Walker. His first four albums all could have gone in this spot. I just picked the first one, but any of them really could have fit. Okay, next up, I'm talking about some of the collaborators that King Krule has worked with that I think shape his sound and are instrumental in understanding his full musical brain. I have Mount Kimby with Love What Survives first. This is an electronic album. I think a lot of people talk about King Krule's electronic influences, which I was tempted to, but I think aren't as relevant to the Ooze as some of his other material. King Krule makes a fantastic feature on this album. It came out the same year as the Ooze does, and I think that if you want to hear something that sounds like King Krule, or at least has some type of spiritual similarity but is more electronic, Mount Kimby is the place to go. Next up, Horsey with Debonair. Same as I just said with electronic influences, this is a lot more of the post-punk and new wave stuff. It's really among the wave of post-punk and new wave that the UK has produced in the last decade. This band includes Archy's brother Jack, and King Krule's contribution to the final track on this album make it my favorite track on the album. Next up, Galgo with Galgo Gray. This is an album from Ignacio Salvadores, aka Galgo. This is the guy who plays the saxophone on the Ooze and most King Krule work. He is one of King Krule's close friends, and Archy has said that he really influenced his music taste, bringing in South American influences and kind of introducing Archy to Brazilian and Argentinian music and stuff like that. I think that this is like the key place to go if you like the Ooze but want something a bit jazzier. And a little bit more electronic as well. Galgo makes some really interesting stuff that sounds a lot like King Krule. You can really clearly hear how much Galgo influenced Krule, and this is definitely something you should check out if you like the Ooze. My last collaborator album to suggest is Rat King with So It Goes. I did not mention hip-hop once yet in this video, but it's pretty well known that Archy Marshall loves hip-hop, and why not pick a hip-hop album that, one, also deals with urban blight and alienation and stuff, as opposed to London and the Ooze. This is about New York, and an album that King Krule is on. Rat King has disbanded, and one of their rappers, Wiki, is a lot more well known for his solo work, but at the same time, I've never heard a rap album that sounds so similar to King Krule's music, and so I really cannot recommend this one enough, even if I think it's slipped under the radar given that the group doesn't exist anymore. You have to check this out. Last up, I'm talking about other albums that I really think match the spiritual vibe of the Ooze but weren't really super classifiable, but I'm going to kind of broadly classify them all as noir, even though they really fit into different genres. The Ooze is an incredibly noir album, which is one of the biggest draws for me because I'm drawn to that aesthetic, and all of these albums also embody that. First up, I have Angelo Badalamenti with the soundtrack from Twin Peaks. David Lynch's media in general, he was a filmmaker if you didn't know, is all very dark and disturbing, and so his soundtrack being like that as well should be no surprise. King Krule loves David Lynch, he said that multiple times, so I would be incredibly shocked if he didn't like Twin Peaks and this music. It's so eerie. As a matter of fact, this soundtrack really pioneered what's known as dark jazz, which is kind of like an ambient noir jazz that I almost mentioned in this video, just didn't bring up because I think this is more interesting. It also has some dream pop and some electronic. This is just one of the best soundtracks I have ever heard, and I really think it captures noir in a similar way that the Ooze does, and if you like the Ooze, you're going to like this too. Next up, I have DJ Shadow with Introducing. This album is possibly the most important plunderphonic instrumental hip-hop plunderphonics sample-based album ever, the first album to only use samples. It's also an incredibly noir album, which is something that I don't think people talk about as much, but man, I was reading Watchmen a few months ago, and I put on Introducing and the Ooze. That was my soundtrack, and it was just like the best vibe ever. I don't know if Krule's actually a DJ Shadow fan, but given how much he does like hip-hop and instrumental hip-hop, I would be shocked if he didn't. Next up, I have Tom Waits with Nighthawks at the Diner. Tom Waits has had a very long and successful career, and this is one of his early albums. This album is kind of like a pseudo-live album. It's kind of pretending to be in a club, although it was actually made in front of an audience, but in a studio. There's a lot of jazz. It's got a killer jazz combo, but it's honestly more of a spoken word album because Tom does a lot more talking and bantering than he does singing. It's an incredibly interesting experience, probably my favorite live album ever. I would say it's possibly a perfect album, and I think that it really I know I'm saying this all the time, but it's just as dark and disturbing as the Ooze is. As a matter of fact, this album gets its title from the painting The Nighthawk by Edward Edward Hopper. I think I got that right. The album cover is kind of based on that, and I think that that painting, if you're not familiar with it, really summarizes the vibe that all this music is going for. It's just noir, peak noir. And my last album for today, Earl Sweatshirt, I Don't Like Shit, I Don't Go Outside. Earl and Archie clearly have mutual respect. I don't know if they've ever formally collaborated, but they certainly have like, you know, met and seem friendly and everything. This is also a hip hop album that seems really dark and depressed in a similar way that the Ooze does. Earl is one of my favorite rappers ever, so talking about him is really fun. It doesn't sound like the Ooze in the same way that So It Goes, that Rat King album does, but I think that if you like the Ooze and you want more hip hop that kind of conjures up a similar vibe, this is the best place to go. That is all of the King Krule Ooze recommendations I'm going to give for now. Thank you very much for watching. I think it's very clear that King Krule takes influence from a ton of different stuff. And again, I never even mentioned all the rap albums that he said he loved or the electronic music. There's so much more that I could have brought up because he, like any true artist, is really pulling from so many different things and constantly exposing himself to new stuff and appreciating it and kind of absorbing it, just like a nice broth might do. So if you as a music fan really find his music interesting, I encourage you to continue checking out stuff that you may not have originally thought would be for you or you've never even heard of, but just to continue explore will make your musical experience so much richer.